Make peace in your home so that you can make peace in all your relations. Make peace in all your relations so that you can make peace in your town. Make peace in your town so that you can make peace in your state. Make peace in your state so that you can make peace in your country. Make peace in your country so that you can make peace in this world. Make peace in this world so that all children and men and women can be fed, find love, and make music together. The making of peace is the gift that we give the world and all life, and I think it is the gift that we give our veterans. I would like to honor the veterans in this congregation this morning by inviting them to come forward and help lighting our chalice. I'll invite first our veterans to come forward, and then those of you who are family members of veterans to come forward. So first veterans, I'll invite family members in just a moment. And family members, I think I will just have you stand where you are. These folks are your family, or if you have other people in your family who aren't here today who are veterans. I invite you who are family members to stand. Thank you for supporting veterans, and veterans, thank you for what you have done and what you have tried to do in this world, and we will do our best to make peace. Thank you. And I invite you to speak the words of our covenant. They are printed in the order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church. Whereas the truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to respect the nurturing power within all of us. Thus do we covenant. Please join in singing our opening hymn in 51, Lady of the Seasons Song. We will sing our young people and their leaders out to young church. This morning, as is often true recently, past year, I have rearranged what I had planned for this morning. And part of what I had planned to do this morning was talk a little bit about just how do we do things in church. Because one of the things that we re-remember every couple of years is that a lot of us are new to church life, and and many people are new to this congregation in particular, and so how we do things is not always obvious, and that we should remember to say it out loud, how we do things, so that we'll at least know what we're talking about, even if we don't completely agree, which is, of course, the Unitarian Universalist way, to not completely agree, but to stay in conversation about it. So that's one of the things that we'll keep trying to do this year, is periodically take a few minutes to talk about how we do things. And then you can ask questions, or we can revise it. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how money works in church, because it can be a tender subject, particularly if you're in a church with Protestant heritage, which we have. Because it gets a little tangled up with self-worth. When you say the word money, it can get muddled right away, and so we sometimes don't talk about it, or are very anxious talking about it, and so it's good to talk about it a little bit here and there when the stakes are low. So that when the stakes are low, it's hard to tell for sure, isn't it? So the world this week isn't really interested in how we do money in church. The world is grappling with much bigger issues. And so this isn't really a low stakes moment to talk about much of anything. But I want you to know that I'm going to keep watching for a moment when there's just a bit of calm, so that we can keep talking about how we do things together, and how we can keep the communication and community weaving of our congregation going well. Because there's enough going on in the world that we need things here to be as easy and smooth as we can get them to be, as we step out to be a big presence in a world that needs us. So the offering this morning is here to support the work that this congregation does, to support each other, to hear each other's stories, and then be ready to step out and be loving and bold in the world around us. There are candles available in 4 places up front if you wish to light one. For a veteran, for peace, for a memory, for hope. The morning offering for all that this congregation does will now be received. Reading this morning is a story, it's one of those folk stories, and I've told it more than once here, and you have likely heard it somewhere else. And because it's a folk story, there are, well, as many versions as there are folk. This version is about a Buddhist monk and his teacher, or his student. He's the teacher. Although Buddhist monks like to mix those up, so. But in this case, the Buddhist monk is walking along Swayze Parkway with his student, and they're listening to the birds and being present to the moment. And they hear a sound out in the water. And they look out there, and at first they think it's some kind of a bird splashing around in the water, and then they realize that there's a person out there in the water who's struggling. And so the student jumps into the river and swims out into the middle, gets hold of the person and swims back to shore. The person was in rough shape, and it's good the student got out there and pulled him to shore. Someone else had a cell phone and called an ambulance, and they took the person who had nearly drowned to the hospital. And the student said, "Oh, it's a good thing we were here to save that person." And the teacher said, "Yes." And a few weeks later, they were walking there again, the leaves were beginning to turn, and they were talking about impermanence. And they heard that bird sound out in the water again, and they looked out, and sure enough, there was another person in the river, struggling, floating downstream. The tide was going out. The student jumped into the river again. It was low tide though, so it was really mucky out there, and dragged the person out. Someone else had a cell phone again, called the ambulance, and took the person to the hospital. And the student said, "It's amazing, we were here to save another person." The teacher said, "Yes, it is." Well, a few weeks later, it had gotten cold. They were walking again. And this time they were talking about the lineage of teachers. And again, someone was in the river floating downstream, and it's cold now, so it's dangerous for anyone to be in the water. But the student knows how to do this now, right? Jumps into the river, saves the person, and pulls them out. And the ambulance comes, and everyone is going to be all right. And as the student is sitting there with one of those heat blankets wrapped around him, shivering and saying, "Isn't it amazing that we have been here every time there has been someone coming down the river? I mean, we've saved them every time." And the teacher said, "Yes. I think, though, that we should go back upstream and figure out why so many people are ending up in the river." For this meditation time, I would like to invite you into a reading practice. I've done this once before, and we're going to use a reading that's in the hymnal, and I'm going to read it through to you for you one time, and then I'll invite you to participate in reading it. It's number 519 on the back of this parade hymnal. And I'll just tell you that Rabindranath Tagore is in our Unitarian lineage of teachers. He was part of a community in India where Unitarianism and the local Hindu tradition were blended. So he's a really interesting part of our story. So I'll read this through one time for you. And then I would like us to do a collective reading, which means if you are really struck by that first phrase, read it out loud. And whoever sort of is moved to read a certain phrase will read it as we go along. So the reading will be read a second time in a sort of rippling way. People who read that first phrase together may not start all at the same moment, and that's fine. We'll get to hear it differently if we hear it in different voices and in slightly different timing. So as I read it the first time, notice which phrases or even words really call to you. And then when we read it through the second time, I invite you to read aloud whichever parts seem like the ones you want to read aloud. And there might not be a single word that you want to read aloud. You want to just listen, and that's fine. And you might want to read the whole thing out loud, and that's good too. But the texture of voices coming in and out lets us hear it differently and lets us experience it differently for our souls. And after we've read it through together, we'll just settle into silence together. Let me not pray to be sheltered from dangers, but be fearless in facing them. Let me not beg for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it. Let me not look for allies in life's battlefield, but to my own strength. Let me not crave in anxious fear to be saved, but hope for the patience to win my freedom. Grant me that I may not be a coward, feeling your mercy in my success alone, but let me find the grasp of your hand in my failure. Let me not pray to be sheltered from dangers,
but to be fearless in facing them. So for the heart to conquer it.
Let me not look for allies in life's battlefield,
but to my own strength.
let me not crave in anxious fear to be saved,
But hope for the patience to win my freedom.
grant me that I may not be coward, feel your mercy in my success alone.
Let me find the grasp of your hand in my failure.
The world is full of sorrow these days. And it is also still full of joy. It is an astonishing practice to allow space for both in the day. And a necessary one, because life is both of those all the time. And so we'll make this space for joy and sorrow together. If you have a joy or a sorrow or a transformation you want to tell us, come and stand with me down front here, and we'll know that there is so much that can't be spoken. And we will listen for that and honor it in the silence between the speaking. But if you have words, come stand with me and share them.
I'm Francine Chandler, and I'm probably not the one to talk about this because I didn't really understand fully what was going on yesterday, but the FUUSE Lego robotics team did their competition yesterday, and they were amazing. There were 12 teams, all of which, except for us, were science and technology schools. And our church did amazing. We placed 5th. And they had another competition where it was just for bragging rights, and they got 2nd place. And they wowed everyone there. So that's our joy.
I'm Deb Merrick. My son, Case, turned 18. He's in the nursery today, so if anybody sees him, you can say happy birthday to him. I can't believe he's 18.
So my non-binary kiddo won a seriously gendered award last week. And I know my pronouns are going to be off because it's half talking about Girl Scouts, but Doc earned her Girl Scout Gold Award last year. It's the highest level in Girl Scouting. And we went to the statewide ceremony last year, and she got to receive that. She got to receive it. I got to receive it, but got the award, and we had my mother there with us, so we had 3 generations of lifelong Girl Scouts. And I hate to even have to say this, but it was the equivalent of the Boy Scout Eagle Award. So next time you see Doc, give her a cheer.
I'm Lisa. The results of last year's election hit me really hard, and I think in a way I lost hope. I kept working, but it was in a kind of dogged persistence sort of mode, and I really felt inside that somehow the forces of intolerance and division and contempt had somehow won in some way. But we had an election this past week, and an amazing array of incredibly diverse candidates were elected across the country. The city of Hoboken, New Jersey, has a turban-wearing Sikh mayor. A Liberian immigrant won an election in Montana. Seattle has an openly lesbian mayor. And 8 transgender people were elected to public office across the country, including one right here in New Hampshire, a person I know. Her name is Jerry Cannon, and she's now on the school board of Somersworth, New Hampshire. And in Virginia, a woman named Danica Rome beat a 13-term incumbent Republican, the self-proclaimed chief homophobe of Virginia. He refused to debate her. He refused to use her proper pronouns. He had earlier in the year introduced a so-called bathroom bill to restrict which bathrooms people could use. And Danica ran on the issues. She wanted to do something about a congested state road, one of the corridors leading into Washington, D.C., and she won. And I have hope again, and that is my joy.
Good morning, Kendra. Good morning, everybody. I'm Maggie Kaliga, and I spent a wonderful day with my veteran. And before I say that, thank you to all the veterans in our community and in our congregation. For your service is our freedom. So while we were doing our raking and cleaning up for hopefully the last time, the leaves just keep falling, I thought about, his service and the fact that he was in a war that's very hard to talk about. And that was my sorrow. A little bit of the day was to think of, what veterans of the Vietnam War have to face. And then my joy was to see members of this community, business people, support veterans in different ways, other than the thoughts that we give them, and we see somebody, we say, thank you for your service. So my husband got a free haircut, he got a free car wash, and he had a lovely meal at Margarita's with his family unit last night.
My name is Herb, and I've been very engaged in politics for the last 50 years, and I've got to say that I've never been more encouraged by seeing so many women across the nation be elected to office. And so I'm hoping that this leads to a much kinder and gentler government.
Can we sing the When I Breathe In peace, just one time together to hold all of the joy and sorrow that's mingling here in us? When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I breathe out love. We are very countercultural in our house, apparently. We sit at our kitchen table a lot and eat and talk. It's really an anchor in our lives. It's a place where Ronan asks a lot of questions. It's a place where we negotiate schedules a fair amount, where we light candles and take pictures for the grandparents. And sometime this past week, my child asked me, has there been a war here? So I had to roll through some answers in my mind and try to scale them. Civil War, the Revolutionary War, the various wars with Native people, and so I said we had, but it had been a long time. And then it was just a few days later that there was another shooting, this time in a church. And so I was sorting through what it meant that there are such frequent shootings in our country now. And I decided that I really had to change the answer that I gave my child to the question that he asked me. I thought maybe, in fact, we are in the midst of a war right now. Maybe we're living in war. It doesn't look like World War II or Vietnam. It is slower moving. And the more I think about it, the more I think we are, as Neil Ferris, our Minister Emeritus, says, at war with ourselves. And I realize people have been talking about culture wars for a while now, but I think there is a level of violence that makes the phrase culture war not quite enough. Because it doesn't seem like you can have what is reported to be 93 gun deaths a day and not understand yourself to be living in a kind of a war zone. And I think I'm not supposed to say this kind of thing from the pulpit. I think I'm supposed to say things that are a little more reassuring than that. I would like to be able to say there are ways that we can be safe. And the more we walk through these days, the more I think we're living in a war zone. I live with a child who reads everything. So we pretty much have to tell him what's going on in the world, because if I'm upset about it, he knows that something's going on. So we had to tell him about the shooting in Texas, and we told him about the Las Vegas shooting. We sat around the table and we talked about it. Hard news is easier to digest if you are being loved. So we have these conversations all the time. And I think he mostly feels safe sitting there, but I think he gets it already. That the world is not safe. And I think we're getting it, that the world is not safe. And it's only worth saying that out loud if it changes something in how we live our lives, and how we understand our living, and how we make our choices. And I mean for it to change our perspectives a little bit in what we do day to day. I think one of the important parts of this realization, at least for me, is to notice that we are all terrorized. there's lots of debate about which violent perpetrator is a terrorist and which is not. And I think really they all are, because what's happened is that everyone is afraid now. And that's what terror is about making sure that every person has a story and an experience, which means that as they go through the day, they're afraid all the time. It's also true, we're hearing all of this news about men in all kinds of positions of power who have been abusive, mostly toward women, but sometimes toward men. And that's another layer of terrorization that I think we're all living through right now. Now, it's not news to a number of people, but the fact that the story is out there so widely now means that everyone is feeling a level of fear and a sense that it's relentless, which it is. So we all have stories now about where you can't go and be safe and who you can't be with and be safe. And of course, we're more aware now that people who are brown and black can't walk down the street, can't drive and be safe. Which means that fear is in our daily choices, that it is probably quietly changing how we think about things all the time. And that's the important thing to notice. I have a really clear moment in my life when I understood that, and I go back to this moment when I need to re-understand it. I went to seminary on the south side of Chicago, at the University of Chicago, which is this incredible Gothic thing on the south side of Chicago. And it's libraries and I don't know how many different schools attached to it, and it's just bustling, and all night long people are thinking. Serious. And you can sort of stay in this bubble of thinking and innovation and wealth for a long time. But it wasn't, I hadn't been there very long. I think it was actually my sister who explained to me that there are streets that you do not cross if you are at the University of Chicago, meaning you don't go to the other side because your life could be in danger on the other side of the street. It's about poverty, it's about segregation, it's about racism. It's a complicated story about why Chicago in particular is like that, and how those lines of race and privilege got drawn. But I remember standing in a green area on one of those streets and looking across the street and thinking, oh, it's that sort of clean a line in this spot between what's supposedly safe and where it's just not safe. And then I have to arrange my life and my choices around what's safe and what's not. And mostly, I think the people at the University of Chicago do arrange their choices around what's safe and what's not, and don't really think about it anymore. Well, another person who you may remember lived on the south side of Chicago, Michelle Obama, and I read an interview with Michelle Obama once. Someone asked her if she was afraid that her husband would be assassinated while he was president. And she said, well, he was a black man living on the south side of Chicago. He might have been killed getting gas. And it could sound almost casual. But what she meant, I think, was they knew it was dangerous. They knew where the lines were and that the lines didn't exist in the same way for them. It was just dangerous everywhere. And they decided not to let that change what they did. Day to day, hour by hour. They decided to keep choosing against the fear. They weren't cavalier about it by any means. They were aware of danger. But they refused to decide based on fear. They knew they weren't safe, and they stood up anyway. Again and again and again. African American people had been clear about this for a long time. And now it comes to the rest of us, that we are not safe, that there is not a clean line between safe and not safe, and if you just stay on this side, you'll be okay. It's not safe anywhere now. And one of the most profound and difficult teachings of Buddhism is the teaching of impermanence. They were talking about that as they were walking down by Swayze Parkway. And we tend to think of this as an idea that change is inevitable, that the leaves will change and fall. But I think there's a more subtle and unsettling part of this teaching, which is that we cannot rely on the next moment to be what this moment is. That we cannot rely on there being safety or peace around us, even if there is right now. And that's why there's so much work in Buddhism about wrestling with your own mind so that you can create inner peace and internal equilibrium. Because externally it's, well, you can't rely on it being there. You might get lucky and have it for a while. And if you do, you should rest in it, knowing that it may disappear. And so you have to find your own to carry with you. I also don't think that this teaching means that we should docilely accept random violence. I think the teaching is that we can't expect the world to be the way we want it to be, and that we can't lose our capacity to think just when we encounter the fact that the world is much more difficult than we want it to be. It is an invitation not to retreat, or not to think that we can retreat from the dangers of the world. This week was surely, as you all have observed, a complicated week. There was an intensification of the violence that we're aware of, and there was an awareness that there are people who are moving in the world to try to reshape the world. But it looks to me like we are going to continue to be terrorized for some time, and that we are going to have consistent work for ourselves if we are going to figure out how to be more full participants in the resistance to that war. So there are a couple of parts of that work and of that resistance. One is what I've been talking about, giving up the illusion that we can somehow step away from it, that we can back away from it, that there's somewhere that we can go that is safer. There might be in any given moment, but really in the world, we have to be present to what is unfolding and not sidestep the existential struggle of being in a world in as much turmoil as ours is in. Now, again, I want to say, it still makes sense to be safe in any given moment if you can be. I'm not saying that one should just always step into danger, but to be aware that choosing based on being afraid won't create the world we want to live in. The Obamas were very aware of the danger. They took a lot of steps to keep Barack safe, and they managed to do so for the 8 years of his presidency. They could very easily have chosen not to have a public life because it was not a safe life. I think I might have made the choice, if I was them, not to step up into a public, in fact, global life. But they did. And the more of us who can make that move in any way, the more likely we are to shift the world around us. So we have to face pretty painful stuff. And I think it's only possible to do that if we do it together, because alone it is just too terrifying. And I think that's part of what church is about. To have this be a place where we can be together and get our courage up. But the thing is, I think that doesn't make this a safe place. It makes this a brave place. A safe place means this is a place where you can retreat from the difficulties and know that it will always be safe and assured here and somehow predictable and reliable in that safety. But being a brave place means this is where you bring your whole self, this is where you bring your uncertainty and your grief and your longing, and we figure out how to live into our biggest selves. Knowing that even here, we have to be aware and facing difficult things. Sometimes small, difficult things, and sometimes big, difficult things. I think we come here so that we can together keep learning what it means to be bold and loving, even when it's terrifying. As I said in my letter this week, the resilience that we need now means that we need connections, and not only to just people we already know and are comfortable with. I think we have to systematically widen our circles of connection. And I've asked you about that a couple of times this year already. And I'm going to keep asking and working on that with us about how to keep making connections with people and groups who don't always feel safe to us. As one of my teachers says, the basic idea, I think, is that we have to care about each other in spite of our differences. We can't let our fears about someone's irrationality confuse us about the person. I think this means not writing people off just because they sound irrational. They may be irrational, they may be confused, but losing track of their humanity means that we all end up in the river. Have any of you seen this little video that's gone around recently about how to respond to a bully? I have to figure out how to show you the whole video. This young man role plays bullying with a young woman. He has the young woman pretend to bully him. And she says the sort of standard insults that a bully would say. And at first he gets defensive and tries to defend himself and tell her that she's wrong. And you know how that goes. And then he replays the scenario, and she says, oh, you're really short. And he says, oh yeah, some of my family's like that. And every time she says something insulting to him, he sort of doesn't really defend himself and says, that's sort of an interesting thing to say. And then he says, you know, you're really tall. Is it great to be tall? And the girl who's trying to bully him just totally loses her ability to keep bullying him. It's fascinating to watch him completely disarm her without ever saying a mean thing back, without appearing to defend himself. And I watched this little video and I realized that this man was doing mental Aikido. So I had to talk to Neil Ferris, our men's German artist, because he does physical Aikido. Some of you clearly know what Aikido is, but it's one of the martial arts and it's a newer form. And I've heard about it from Neil over the years, and I've always been interested in it because it's a defensive art, but that just means in the teaching of it, it's not focused on how do you attack. It's focused on how do you make sure no one gets hurt. In fact, Neil described it to me as how do you make sure that everyone's safe. And maybe all the martial arts are like this, but when Neil talks about it, he talks about that in order to do this, you have to focus on the energy of the other person and how you use their energy to make the change that you want to see. So Neil showed me a few Aikido moves in his kitchen this week. And he's made an offer to show them to you as well another day, probably not in the kitchen. So there were two things. One is he said, it's when someone is attacking, it's our natural, and this is, when I'm talking about this now, I'm not talking about the extreme situations. I'm talking about the things that we are dealing with day to day. It is, but when someone attacks, our tendency is to move away. If it's physical, we back away like this. And if it's an emotional attack, we either sort of do this or get defensive. But in Aikido, and I think in lots of disciplines, that the teaching is to get closer, that you're actually safest if you get close, which feels completely counterintuitive. But in this video about bullying, which I will figure out a way to get to you, that's essentially what that man did. When the person said something insulting, he just said, oh, yeah, some people in my family are kind of short. He just stayed right there next to her and didn't back away at all. And it just rolled off of him. One of the moves that Neil did with me is he asked me to punch him, which I did not do. But I did move my fist toward him like this, and he grabbed my arm and pulled me like this until we were back to back, his arm along my arm and his back against my back. And I was completely disarmed, not that I had really been armed, but as he pulled my arm against his and my back against his back, he said, and now we're both safe. And we're looking at the world from the same perspective. So I think we have to be more skillful at mental Aikido. Figure out how to move in closer when things seem hard. And remember that we're trying to keep ourselves and whoever we're in conflict with safe. That we all need to be safer. One of the reasons I loved that bullying video is that he did this fantastic demonstration of mental Aikido. And then at the end of it he said, and if someone is trying to physically hurt you, you can't do what I'm doing with them because that's assault, and you have to work with that differently. So I want to say that now too, that I'm talking about how to work with mental Aikido, knowing that we live in a world that has gotten more contentious, and you never have to move in if your being is not safe. You can always move away as quickly as possible. And I would like us to learn some mental Aikido together. How can we be closer to people with whom we disagree passionately? How can we take the content of what someone is saying less personally and learn how to find the human connection which might make us both safe? Maybe that physical practice of Aikido can offer us some metaphorical answers. And Neil has offered to do some teaching here on the physical practice of Aikido and the philosophy and spiritual perspective of it as well. How we might use it to keep ourselves safe in this tumultuous world. And also to keep anyone who is being aggressive, particularly in the psychological and intellectual ways toward us, how we can keep those people safe as well. So if you would like to have a kitchen table version of Aikido, there's a sign-up sheet in the community room. And for those people who sign up, we'll try to find a time when Neil can demonstrate a little bit of Aikido and talk about Aikido a little bit and think about how we can use this in this world. And I want to just say practically, last week there was an attack on a church. And it's not the first one. And the Exeter police have offered us a training about how to deal with that physical problem, should it arrive on our doorstep. And we're going to participate in that training, and we'll figure out what that means for our community life together. And that training isn't going to solve the larger problem of ongoing tension and violence in our society. But it is like an oxygen mask on a plane, and it seems like a good idea to have a plan. And we'll keep working together to find our way back upstream. Keep finding ways to change the conversations from the yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, wrong, right conversation to maybe we can be safe together and looking at the world from the same perspective. I am so aware that talking about safety is immensely difficult, and that many people have early stories that mean that it is hard to ever feel safe in the world. And that we live in a world that is calling up that fear all the time. And so if the way I have talked about it today has made it difficult for any one of you in particular, I hope that you will let me know and that we can figure out how to keep talking about the world as it is and our own stories and staying connected. Sorting out community life and brave space is complicated. And I always appreciate your good thinking and your big hearts as we figure this out together. One of the ways to keep being together in this human endeavor is to keep singing together. I hope you'll join in singing hymn 108, My Life Flows On. I bring the light of our chalice forward. Take this light and be brave. Please join in our unison benediction. The words are printed in the order of service.
O peace, sweet truth, give thanks each day, respect the earth